Keanu Reeves had always been known for his laid-back, humble attitude, but even someone as grounded as him couldn't help but feel disconnected from the everyday workings of his own diner, Keanu's Kitchen. The business was a hit, a favorite. Hangout spot for locals, buzzing with the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling pancakes. But Keanu was just the owner on paper. He wanted more. He wanted to know what really happened behind the scenes when he wasn't there, to understand what his staff went through on a daily basis and how the kitchen operated without the glare of his celebrity status. One morning, Keanu woke up with a strange thought swirling in his mind. What if I went undercover? He was no stranger to playing different characters on screen, but this would be different. This time he'd be playing the role of just another worker, blending in with the crew, working alongside them, and experiencing the grind from their perspective. With a casual look, a plain hoodie, sunglasses, and a cap pulled low over his eyes, Keanu walked through the back door of Keanu's Kitchen as if he were any other person looking for a job. The staff didn't recognize him immediately. To them, he was just another hire trying to earn a paycheck, maybe a little older, maybe a little quieter than most, but no one suspected that the owner of the diner was standing right there in the middle of the kitchen, ready to dive into the mess of it all. As he stepped in, the sounds of sizzling pans, the clinking of utensils, and the chatter of the staff filled the air. It was chaotic, loud, and a little disorienting, but Keanu felt a rush of excitement. He was here to get his hands dirty, but what he didn't expect was what he would hear next. From the corner of his eye, he saw Marco, the head chef, barking orders at the kitchen staff. Marco was a seasoned chef, tough as nails, and everyone knew not to mess with him. But then Keanu heard something that made his stomach drop. Marco was yelling at Lucy, the new kitchen assistant, in a tone that could only be described as cruel. "You're going to ruin everything if you keep screwing up like this. Get your act together or you won't last a week," Marco shouted, his voice rising over the clatter of dishes and sizzling food. Lucy's face went pale, her hands trembling as she tried to clean up the mess she'd made. Keanu's heart sank as he watched the tension mount in the kitchen. It wasn't just an unfortunate mistake. It was clear Marco's temper was a regular occurrence. Keanu was no stranger to conflict, but this felt different. This felt personal, almost unfair. "Is this how we treat new employees?" Keanu thought to himself, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. He was about to find out what went on, when the owner wasn't around, and already it felt like he was in over his head. But the thing that struck him the most, the thing that left a lingering knot in his chest, Marco wasn't stopping. The more Lucy tried to explain, the angrier Marco became, his words growing sharper, cutting deeper with every sentence. The rest of the staff didn't seem to notice, absorbed in their own tasks. Keanu was starting to feel like an intruder, an invisible presence in a storm he didn't know how to weather. Just then Marco turned, his voice now steady, but still filled with venom. "You don't belong here if you can't keep up." Keanu felt a sudden urge to step in, to say something, anything. But for now he held back. He wanted to see the full picture before making any moves. He had no idea how this would unfold, but one thing was certain. Things weren't as perfect behind the scenes as they seemed, and that realization shook him to his core. As Keanu continued to observe, he couldn't help but wonder, how long had this been going on? What was it really like to work in this kitchen under these conditions? He made a mental note to get to know Lucy better. And Marco? Well, Keanu wasn't sure yet what he was going to do about him, but he knew one thing for sure. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? Keanu had barely gotten used to the chaos of the kitchen when the tension reached a new level. The diner, known for its comfort food and friendly atmosphere, had a very different vibe behind the scenes. The constant hum of activity seemed to hide something darker, something that wasn't visible to the regular customers, and Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The morning rush was relentless. The kitchen staff moved like a well-oiled machine, each person in their own rhythm, chopping, stirring, and plating with precision. Keanu kept his head down, blending in with the crew, trying to avoid attention. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't ignore Marco's mounting frustration with Lucy. She was still new to the job, and though Keanu could see she was trying hard to keep up, Marco's impatience was slowly wearing her down. He had started making small, snide comments every time she made a mistake. Nothing too overt, but just enough to keep her on edge. "You're gonna need a lot more than that to impress me," Marco had sneered earlier, as Lucy struggled to get the sauce just right. Keanu could feel the weight of the moment. He was getting more involved in the day-to-day operations, helping out where he could, but Marco's behavior kept bugging him. He knew it wasn't just a matter of Lucy needing to improve. It was how Marco was dealing with her mistakes. He wasn't teaching her. He wasn't guiding her. He was just tearing her down bit by bit. The more Keanu observed, the more he realized this wasn't just about cooking. It was about something deeper, something personal. Marco wasn't just a perfectionist, he was controlling, and not in a healthy way. Every time Lucy faltered, Marco's temper flared. The constant yelling was becoming more frequent, and Keanu could see it was beginning to affect the entire staff. They were all walking on eggshells, trying not to set off Marco's volatile mood. Keanu decided to approach Jamie, the sous chef, to get a better sense of what was really going on. Jamie was the closest thing to a friend in the kitchen, someone who had been with Marco for years and had an understanding of how things ran. "Hey, Jamie," Keanu said quietly, trying not to draw attention. "What's up with Marco lately? He's been really tough on Lucy. I mean, I get that the kitchen's high pressure, but this feels different." Jamie glanced over at Marco, who was busy yelling at another staff member for taking too long to plate an order. Then, lowering his voice, Jamie spoke with a hint of frustration. "It's been like this for a while, honestly," he admitted. "Marco's been running the kitchen with an iron fist. He's always been hard on the staff. But lately, it's gotten worse. He's not just the boss anymore. He's like a drill sergeant. And Lucy, she's just the latest target." Keanu frowned. "Why? She's new, sure, but she's trying. Why go after her like that?" Jamie sighed, looking over at Lucy, who was nervously stirring a pot in the corner. "It's about control. Marco doesn't want anyone to threaten his position. He's afraid of losing his status in the kitchen, and he sees anyone who's new, especially someone like Lucy who shows potential, as a threat. He doesn't like being shown up, even if it's not intentional." Keanu nodded, understanding the situation a little better now. It wasn't just about Lucy's mistakes. It was about Marco's insecurities and how they were manifesting in the way he treated people. It was a pattern, and Keanu had seen it before. People in positions of power often lash out when they feel their control slipping away. But even as he processed this, Keanu felt a pang of empathy for Lucy. She didn't deserve this. No one did. A sudden crash echoed through the kitchen, snapping Keanu out of his thoughts. He turned just in time to see Lucy, her face flushed with embarrassment, standing in front of a broken plate. Marco had already started to shout before she could even apologize. "You really think you can handle this job? You're making us look bad. You're a liability, Lucy." Keanu felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. Marco's words were cutting through the air. Like a knife, it wasn't just anger, it was disdain. Marco didn't care to teach or to help. He just wanted to break Lucy down. Keanu's hands clenched into fists as he watched the scene unfold. He had to do something. This wasn't the environment he wanted for his staff. This wasn't the kind of place he envisioned when he opened Keanu's kitchen. He glanced at Jamie, who was watching with a mix of concern and resignation. "Is this the way it's always been?" Keanu asked quietly. Jamie nodded, though he looked uncomfortable. "Marco's been like this for a long time, but it's never been this bad. No one's willing to speak up against him, you know. He's the head chef. People are afraid of losing their jobs." Keanu's mind raced. He wasn't afraid to confront difficult situations, but this was more than just a workplace issue. This was about creating an environment where people felt respected, where they could grow, not be torn down. It's time to step up, Keanu thought. I can't just stand by and let this happen anymore. As the day continued, Keanu couldn't shake the image of Lucy standing there, her hands shaking as she picked up the broken plate. He couldn't let her or anyone else be treated like that. He had to act, and soon. The next few days at Keanu's kitchen were a whirlwind. Keanu had been trying to juggle his undercover role as a line cook, while also processing everything he'd witnessed. His initial sense of helplessness was slowly being replaced with a gnawing feeling that he couldn't just let things continue as they were. The thought of leaving things as they were, allowing Marco to continue belittling Lucy and creating a toxic environment in the kitchen, didn't sit well with him. But the question that kept nagging at Keanu was how to step in. He couldn't just march in as the owner, not yet. The whole point of his undercover mission was to understand the reality of the situation without his fame or reputation influencing the staff's behavior. If he exposed himself now, it could undo everything he'd learned. Keanu had always been someone who preferred action over words, but this situation was different. The power dynamic in the kitchen wasn't something that could be fixed by one confrontation. It would take more than just a single talk with Marco. He needed a plan. Keanu knew he had to get more information before he acted. His first instinct was to speak with Lucy, to get her perspective on what had been happening behind the scenes. But when he tried to approach her during lunch break, she seemed distant, almost reluctant to talk. She was always polite, but clearly uncomfortable around him. It was as though the weight of the kitchen had already worn her down, to the point where she didn't want to burden anyone with her troubles. Not even someone she thought was just another employee. Keanu decided to talk to Jamie again. He had noticed the sous chef was one of the few people who wasn't completely afraid of Marco. Maybe Jamie had some insight into how they could approach the situation without making things worse. They met in the break room while the rest of the staff was busy prepping for the evening rush. Keanu leaned back against the wall, running a hand through his hair. "Jamie, I need your help," Keanu began, his voice low, making sure no one else could overhear. "I can't just sit by and watch Marco treat Lucy like this. It's gotten out of hand, but if I step in now, it might make things worse. I need to know how to handle this. What's the best way to confront him?" Jamie was quiet for a moment, his eyes flicking to the door as if checking to make sure no one was coming in. "Marco's a tough one," Jamie said quietly, glancing around again. "He doesn't take kindly to being challenged, and honestly, no one in the kitchen's really in a position to stand up to him. But you're in a unique spot." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? You've been working here as just another employee, right? That gives you some credibility. You're not just the owner walking in like a boss. People are seeing you work alongside them, and they respect that. If you step in at the right moment, they'll back you up. But if you just go in guns blazing and tell him to stop, you risk losing everything. Not just Marco, but the whole crew. A lot of them are loyal to him. They'll see it as you trying to take over." Keanu nodded slowly, processing the weight of Jamie's words. He hadn't considered that the kitchen staff might be so deeply entrenched in Marco's leadership, despite the toxicity of it. He had thought it was a matter of right and wrong, a clear-cut issue where the right thing to do would be obvious. But now it seemed like stepping in would be a much more delicate matter. "I get it," Keanu said, his voice a little heavier. "It's not just about Marco. It's about the whole dynamic in here. I can't just make it about me versus him." Jamie leaned forward slightly, his eyes softening. "Exactly. It's about making sure the kitchen runs well and that everyone's treated with respect. You have to remember, Keanu, people don't change overnight. It's going to take time. You're not just fixing Marco. You're fixing the culture he's created." Keanu let out a deep breath, running his fingers through his hair. This was more complicated than he'd imagined, but he knew Jamie was right. If he did this the wrong way, it could ruin everything, not just for Lucy, but for the rest of the staff as well. "I'll be careful," Keanu said finally, "but I need to do something. I'm not just going to sit back and watch this anymore." That night, as the dinner rush hit its peak, Keanu couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency in his chest. He continued to work quietly alongside the staff, his eyes constantly flicking to Marco, who was barking orders with a fury that seemed to go beyond just frustration. Every mistake Lucy made, Marco's response grew harsher. Keanu saw how the others, even if they weren't directly involved, were affected by the tension. The kitchen felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode, and he could feel it tightening with every minute that passed. At one point, Lucy dropped a tray of plates. Marco was on her in an instant, yelling before she even had a chance to apologize. The look on her face was one of complete defeat, her eyes welling up with tears. Keanu could see the self-doubt creeping in, the weight of Marco's criticism bearing down on her. Something snapped inside Keanu. He had waited long enough. As Marco raised his voice once more, Keanu walked up to him, his footsteps quiet, but determined. "Marco," Keanu said, his voice low but firm. Marco turned, his expression hard, but when he saw who it was, the tension in his face briefly softened. "What do you want?" he snapped, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "I need to talk to you," Keanu said, standing tall and looking Marco directly in the eye. "Now." Marco hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He led Keanu to the back of the kitchen, away from the rest of the staff, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What's this about?" Marco asked, crossing his arms over his chest. Keanu took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've been watching you in the kitchen, and what I'm seeing isn't leadership, Marco. It's fear. You're creating an environment that's toxic, and it's affecting everyone, especially Lucy. No one should feel that way here." Marco scoffed, but Keanu didn't back down. "You can yell all you want, but that's not how you lead. If you really want this kitchen to work, you need to start showing some respect, not just to Lucy, but to everyone." Marco's eyes flashed, with anger, and for a moment Keanu feared he might snap. But then a different emotion flickered behind Marco's gaze. Was it shame? Guilt? Keanu couldn't tell. "You don't know what it's like," Marco said, his voice softer now. "You don't know the pressure, the stakes. You think this is just some diner, but this is my life. I can't afford to have anyone mess it up." Keanu nodded slowly. "I get it. But there's more than one way to lead, Marco. And tearing people down, isn't it?" There was a long pause. Marco didn't respond right away, but Keanu could see something in his eyes shift. Maybe it wasn't a big change, but it was something. "Think about it," Keanu said quietly, before turning to walk away. The days following Keanu's confrontation with Marco felt like walking on a tightrope. The atmosphere in Keanu's kitchen had shifted, but it wasn't a smooth transition. There was a tangible tension in the air. Marco was still Marco, and though he'd backed off a little after their talk, the cracks in his authority were starting to show. He wasn't the same confident, feared chef that he used to be, but he wasn't exactly willing to admit that he had a problem either. Keanu was doing his best to stay in the background, sticking to his role as just another kitchen hand. But he couldn't ignore the fact that something was brewing beneath the surface. Marco's temper was still there, bubbling under the surface, and Lucy, despite her attempts to stay focused, was beginning to unravel. One afternoon, as the lunch rush came to an end, Keanu found himself watching Lucy more closely than ever. She was at the prep station, chopping vegetables, her movements slower than usual, her gaze unfocused. Keanu noticed how she kept glancing over at Marco, who was doing his best to pretend everything was fine, while he barked orders at everyone. But Keanu could see the way his jaw tightened whenever Lucy made a mistake, the way his eyes narrowed. As he looked at her, then it happened. As Lucy attempted to carry a heavy tray of dishes, she stumbled, knocking the tray onto the floor. The crash echoed through the kitchen like thunder. Marco was on her in an instant, his voice rising to a roar. "You're a disaster. How many times do I have to tell you to be careful? You're going to lose us customers." Keanu's heart sank as he watched Lucy's face turn pale. She looked on the verge of tears, her body stiff with the weight of Marco's anger. But instead of responding, she just stood there, trembling. Keanu could feel the heat of the moment creeping up on him. The anger in the pit of his stomach was growing, not just at Marco's treatment of Lucy, but at the system that allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. The whole kitchen had become a place of fear, where every mistake led to punishment, and every success went unnoticed, Marco, Keanu said, his voice steady but full of authority. "That's enough." Marco spun around, his face contorting with surprise. "What did you say?" Keanu took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "You're not going to talk to her like that anymore. You're not going to treat anyone like that." In this kitchen. For a moment the kitchen fell silent. Everyone stopped what they were doing, looking between Keanu and Marco. The tension was palpable. It felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting for an explosion. "So you don't get to tell me how to run my kitchen, Reeves," Marco sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can just waltz in here, pretend to be one of us and start making demands? I built this place. I keep it running. I don't need you to lecture me." Keanu stood his ground, his eyes unwavering. "I may not be the chef here, Marco, but I'm the owner, and I'm telling you this behavior stops now." The room was still for another long moment. Then Marco let out a bitter laugh. "You think I'm scared of you? You're just some movie star playing pretend. You've got no idea what it takes to run a kitchen like this." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "I know what it takes to treat people with respect. I know what it takes to build a team, not break it down. And you're not doing that. You're not leading, and you're bullying." Marco's face twisted in fury. "You want to go there, Reeves?" he hissed. "You have no idea what I'm dealing with. This kitchen is everything to me. If I lose control here, I lose everything, everything." Keanu paused. He could see the raw emotion behind Marco's anger. But it didn't excuse the way he had been treating his staff, especially not Lucy. "You don't lose control," Keanu said quietly, his voice firm. "You give it up every time you tear someone down. A real leader builds people up, Marco, not crushes them under their boot." The kitchen was silent again. Marco's face had turned a deep red, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned away, muttering something under his breath as he walked back to his station. Keanu could feel the eyes of the entire staff on him. Some of them were relieved, others looked nervous, but they all knew that this moment had shifted something in the kitchen. Keanu had crossed a line, but in doing so, he had also sent a clear message that things couldn't stay the way they were. As Keanu walked away from Marco, he caught a glimpse of Lucy. She was standing near the counter, her hands still shaking, but she was looking at him, really looking at him, for the first time since he'd started working there. Her eyes were full of gratitude, but there was something else there too, something that made Keanu's chest tighten with the weight of his decision. The next few hours were tense. Marco kept to himself, but the energy in the kitchen had changed. The staff was still on edge, unsure of what would happen next, but there was an unspoken understanding that things weren't the same anymore. The culture of fear had been cracked, if only slightly. And Keanu could see that the staff was starting to feel the weight of that shift. Lucy was quieter than usual, but as the evening rush wound down, Keanu saw her approach him. She hesitated at first, but then, with a small but determined smile, she walked up to him. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the clattering of dishes. Keanu smiled back, relieved to see her speak up. "You don't have to thank me. You deserve better than what Marco's been giving you." "We all do," Lucy nodded, her eyes welling up with emotion. I didn't think anyone would ever stand up for me. Not here." Keanu's heart clenched as he watched her, knowing that he'd made the right decision, but knowing that the battle was far from over. He had taken the first step, but it was just the beginning of a much larger journey. The road ahead would be long, and he couldn't be sure that Marco would change overnight, or that the rest of the staff would suddenly feel safe. But for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt a sense of hope. It was fragile, but it was there, and that was enough. The weeks following Keanu's confrontation with Marco were filled with both subtle victories and lingering doubts. The initial change in the kitchen was noticeable. The dynamic had shifted, and a few of the other cooks were slowly becoming more confident, as if the air was finally clearing. But Keanu knew the peace was fragile. Marco hadn't changed overnight, and the tension that simmered beneath the surface was still there. Keanu had been keeping a low profile, continuing his work as just another line cook, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the storm would hit again. Marco was unpredictable, and Keanu could feel it in the way he moved around the kitchen. There were moments of silence when he would catch Marco's glare, the venom in his eyes unmistakable, like the chef was biding his time. Keanu wasn't sure what would set him off, but he knew it was coming. Then, one night, it happened. The kitchen was as hectic as ever, the orders piling up during the dinner rush. Keanu was at the stove, keeping an eye on the clock as the minutes ticked by. Everyone was working at a fever pitch, their faces tense with the stress of the fast-paced environment. And then, out of nowhere, Marco snapped. "Lucy!" Marco's voice sliced through the air like a knife. "You've messed up the garnish again. How many times do I have to show you?" Lucy, who was attempting to plate a dish, froze. Her eyes widened in fear, but she didn't say a word. The kitchen went quiet for a split second, and in that moment Keanu saw everything. The exhaustion, the fear, the defeat in her eyes. It wasn't just a mistake. It was the culmination of weeks of pressure. And Marco wasn't stopping. Keanu didn't think. He just reacted. His hand tightened around the spatula in his grip, and before he even realized what he was doing, he stepped forward. "Marco, enough!" Keanu's voice rang out, cutting through the tension in the room. "You've been riding her like this for weeks. It's not right." Marco spun around, his face flushed with rage. "You think you can tell me how to run my kitchen now, Reeves? You've crossed the line." Keanu's jaw clenched. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but it was time. He had to stand his ground. "No, Marco. What you're doing is wrong. You've been bullying her and the rest of the crew, and it's destroying the kitchen. I won't let it happen anymore." For a brief moment, Marco looked taken aback, his eyes flicking over to the rest of the crew. They were watching, waiting, but no one was stepping in. It was clear they had been waiting for someone to take a stand. Keanu could feel the weight of their gazes, the pressure mounting. Marco sneered, his face contorted with fury. "You're not even a chef. You think you know how to run things? You think this is just about feelings? This is about control, Keanu. If you don't have control, you have nothing." Keanu felt the words hit like a punch to the gut. Marco was right about one thing. A kitchen had to have control, but it couldn't be control through fear, through intimidation. Keanu was finally seeing the deeper truth. Marco's need for control wasn't just about the kitchen. It was about his own insecurities. He was lashing out because he didn't know any other way to lead. "I don't want control," Keanu said, his voice low but steady. "I want a team. People who support each other, who trust each other. You can't lead with fear, Marco. That's not leadership. That's domination." For a moment there was silence in the kitchen. Marco's eyes darkened, his anger building with every passing second. The others were frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Keanu could see the storm in Marco's eyes, but he didn't back down. Marco's fist slammed down onto the counter. "Get out," he spat. "I don't need you here. You think you're better than me? Fine. Get out of my kitchen." Keanu's heart pounded, but he held his ground. "You're wrong, Marco. You're not going to run me out of here, and you're not going to bully anyone else either. This ends tonight." There was no turning back now. Keanu could feel the energy in the room shift as the other cooks began to move, some looking at each other, some glancing at Marco, unsure of what would happen. But in that moment, something changed. The power Marco had held over the kitchen for so long began to crumble, and Keanu knew this was the moment that would decide everything. With his gaze never leaving Marco, Keanu made a decision. He stepped toward the door, his eyes hard but filled with resolve. "I'm leaving, but you're either going to change or you're going to lose this place. The kitchen, the staff, everything." Keanu's words hung in the air as he walked out of the kitchen, the door swinging behind him with a finality that echoed in the hearts of everyone left inside. Keanu spent the rest of the evening in his car, parked in the lot behind Keanu's kitchen. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew he couldn't go back in without things changing. He needed to figure out what to do with Marco. He needed to know if the rest of the staff would be better off without him, or if there was a chance for reconciliation. As the night dragged on, Keanu found himself lost in thought. He had hoped that confronting Marco would lead to a breakthrough, maybe even a change in Marco's attitude, or at least an acknowledgement of the damage he had caused. But it had done more than that. It had forced the entire kitchen to come face to face with what had been happening behind closed doors. Keanu knew he couldn't just walk away and let everything fall apart. He had started this mission because he believed in the potential of the people at Keanu's kitchen, in Lucy, Jamie, and everyone else who had been caught in Marco's wake. They deserved better. They deserved a chance. As the hours passed and the restaurant finally closed for the night, Keanu felt his resolve harden. He couldn't just walk away. He wasn't done here yet. The kitchen wasn't broken, it was wounded, and he was determined to help it heal. The next morning was quiet. The hum of the early morning routine seemed different, quieter, almost expectant. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow across the parking lot behind Keanu's kitchen. Keanu sat in his car while staring out at the building, wondering what had changed overnight. He had given Marco a chance to come to his senses, to fix what had broken. But deep down, Keanu knew the decision wasn't Marco's to make alone. The decision belonged to the people of the kitchen, to the staff who had been broken down over time but were still fighting to stay afloat, and to Keanu, who had no intention of letting this place sink. He knew there was one thing left to do: take responsibility. He couldn't expect change from others unless he was willing to lead by example. He couldn't expect Marco to change overnight, but he could give the kitchen a chance to heal. With a deep breath, Keanu stepped out of the car and headed toward the front door. Inside, the atmosphere was different. It was early, and only a few staff members were there prepping for the day's service. Keanu paused for a moment as he walked through the kitchen doors. There was an air of uncertainty, like no one knew what to expect after the events of the night before. Lucy was already there, standing by the sink, cleaning the trays with a quiet, focused energy. She looked up when she saw him, her eyes filled with gratitude but also worry. The last thing Keanu wanted was to create more chaos. "You all right?" he asked gently. Lucy gave him a small, hesitant smile. "Yeah, just trying to make it through today." She paused, glancing around the kitchen before speaking again, her voice softer now. "Everyone's been talking about last night. What's going to happen with Marco?" Keanu stood by her, considering his response carefully. The weight of what he was about to say wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about Marco anymore. It was about everything he had started when he stepped into that kitchen, about the kind of place Keanu's kitchen could be. It wasn't just about cooking, it was about trust, respect, teamwork. "I don't know yet," Keanu said honestly, "but I can tell you this: I'm not giving up on this kitchen. You all deserve a place where you feel safe, where you feel like you belong. Marco, he's got a lot to work through. But it's not just up to him. We're all in this together now, and that means we all have a part in how this kitchen moves forward." Lucy looked at him for a long moment, searching his face, as if trying to gauge whether he meant it. Finally, she nodded. "You're right, we've been putting up with a lot, but we don't want this place to fall apart." Keanu smiled, relieved. "Good, and I'm not going anywhere. Neither should any of you." Just as he said that, the door to the back room opened. Marco stepped into the kitchen, looking tired, his face still pale from the tension of the previous night. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, but Keanu didn't flinch. He had made his decision. He wasn't going to let Marco's anger rule the kitchen anymore. Marco's gaze flicked to Keanu before he addressed the rest of the staff. "Listen," he said, his voice flat. "I messed up last night. I know I've been hard on you all. I'm not proud of it, but things need to change around here. I can't do this alone. I need you all, and I'll work to earn back your trust." There was a pause as Marco scanned the room, his eyes lingering on Lucy, then Jamie, and finally Keanu. Keanu could feel the weight of the moment. Marco had taken the first step, but it was just a step. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start. The real challenge would be putting in the work day by day to rebuild the trust that had been broken. "Marco," Keanu said, his voice steady, "this kitchen's not just yours, it's ours. We all have a role in how it runs. I'm glad to hear you want to change, but it's going to take time, it's going to take patience, and most importantly, it's going to take respect. You can't just snap your fingers and expect everything to be fixed." Marco nodded, swallowing his pride. "I know, but I'm willing to try. For all of you. For this place." Keanu felt a flicker of hope rise within him. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start, and that's all any of them could ask for. The rest of the day passed quietly. There were still moments of tension, but the air felt lighter. Marco had stepped back, letting the team take charge more often. Lucy was more confident, her movements fluid as she worked with the rest of the staff. Even Jamie seemed to relax a little, letting go of some of the anxiety that had been etched in his face. By the end of the shift, Keanu gathered the team together in the break room. They were exhausted, but there was something different in the air, but something hopeful. He could see it in their eyes. "I'm proud of all of you," Keanu began, his voice warm. "You're the heart of this place, and we've got a long way to go, but I believe in all of you. We're going to make this kitchen better, not just for the customers, but for each other." There were murmurs of agreement, and Keanu could see that for the first time the team felt like they were truly part of something. They weren't just workers in a restaurant, they were a family. And for the first time since he'd walked into that kitchen, Keanu felt like he belonged too. This wasn't just about running a diner, it was about creating something real. A space where people felt valued, and it was a space worth fighting for. As he walked out of the break room, he caught Lucy's eye. She smiled at him, the weight of the past few weeks lifting from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly. Keanu smiled back. "We're all in this together." The following week was a turning point for Keanu's kitchen. The team had been working hard to rebuild not just the kitchen, but the very foundation of trust that had been cracked under Marco's reign. Keanu watched as Lucy, Jamie, and the others began to take more initiative. They had grown stronger, more confident, and even Marco, though still struggling with his temper, was beginning to show signs of improvement. He wasn't perfect, and Keanu knew it would take time, but there were moments when Marco stepped aside and let the team lead, showing he was learning to trust them as much as they were learning to trust him. It was on one particular morning, after a particularly brutal shift the night before, that Keanu found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The early morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the kitchen as he worked with the others to prep for the breakfast rush. For the first time in weeks, there wasn't a sense of anxiety or tension hanging over everything. The energy in the kitchen was focused, calm, and cooperative. Keanu stood by the stove, flipping pancakes with a practiced hand, when Marco came over to join him. There was an awkward pause between them, but Keanu was ready for it. He had learned that sometimes silence was the best way to let people work through their own emotions. "I need to apologize," Marco said quietly, his voice softer than Keanu had ever heard it. "I've been a real jerk. I've taken this kitchen for granted, and I've taken you all for granted. But I'm willing to do better. I hope that's enough." Keanu looked at Marco, taking in the sincerity in his eyes. It was a far cry from the defensive chef who had practically thrown him out weeks ago. Keanu had seen people change before, but seeing Marco, who had been so locked in his ways, open up like this felt like a small miracle. "It's not about being perfect, Marco," Keanu said, turning away from the stove to meet his eyes. "It's about making the effort day after day. I'm not asking you to be anyone you're not, but I do expect you to show up for this team. Every day." Marco nodded slowly, taking in Keanu's words. "I can do that. I'll try. For all of you." Just then, Lucy and Jamie entered the kitchen, ready for their shift. They exchanged glances before turning to Keanu, their expressions wary but hopeful. Keanu could sense that they were still uncertain. No one could erase the past. In a few days. But there was something different about them now. They weren't walking on eggshells anymore. They were taking ownership of the kitchen, and it showed. "Morning," Jamie greeted, his voice no longer as tense. He moved to start prepping vegetables, working alongside Keanu with an easy familiarity that had been missing before. Lucy smiled at Keanu as she wiped down the counters. "Feels different in here today," she said, "like we're actually working together." Keanu grinned. "We are. That's the point, right?" The team worked like a well-oiled machine through the morning, communicating with ease, sharing jokes, and lending a hand when necessary. Marco, still holding back his natural instinct to dominate, was starting to get it. He wasn't micromanaging anymore. He wasn't barking orders at the staff. Instead, he was encouraging them, offering help when needed, but trusting them to handle their responsibilities. By the time the lunch rush hit, the kitchen felt like a completely different place. It was calm, organized, and even, dare Keanu think it, fun. Marco had fallen into a rhythm of collaboration, his leadership becoming less about control and more about guiding the team through the chaos of service. Keanu stood back for a moment, watching everything unfold. The noise of the kitchen was familiar, The sizzling of food, the clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, but the feeling in the air was unmistakably different. It was the feeling of a team coming together, of people supporting each other through thick and thin. Keanu had done his part to help foster this change, but he knew it was the team who had truly transformed. They were the ones who had turned Keanu's kitchen around, not him. As the lunch rush finally died down and the kitchen quieted, Keanu wiped his hands on his apron and looked around the room. The weight of the past month still lingered, but it was no longer a burden. It was a lesson learned, and more importantly, it was a new beginning. Marco approached him once more, this time with a small but genuine smile on his face. "You were right," he said. "I've been a part of the problem for so long, but now I want to be part of the solution." Keanu nodded, his heart lifting with relief. "We all have to be. No one's perfect, Marco, but we all have to show up, and we have to be willing to do the work." Marco's eyes softened as he looked at Keanu. "I'm glad you stuck around, man. I didn't think anyone would be able to change things, but you've done more than that. You've changed the whole vibe in this place." Keanu smiled, feeling the weight of those words. "We've all done it together." The days that followed were smoother. Marco was still learning, still catching himself when old habits threatened to take over, but the atmosphere in the kitchen was no longer one of fear or tension. There was a sense of camaraderie, a sense that they were all in it together. The fire. Customers noticed the change too. The food was as good as ever, but the energy in the restaurant felt more inviting, more welcoming. Keanu spent his days working side by side with the team, not just as a chef, but as a leader. He knew that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about helping others find their way. It was about trust. And it was about knowing that, in the end, a kitchen wasn't just about the food, it was about the people behind it. As the weeks passed, Keanu's kitchen became more than just a place to eat. It became a place where people came together, where the staff felt valued, and where every person who walked through the door could sense that something had changed. Keanu had learned what it meant to truly lead, to face the toughest challenges head-on and to rebuild from the ashes. And most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones that happened inside the kitchen, within the hearts and minds of the people who made it all come alive. Just as Keanu's kitchen was finally hitting its stride, something unexpected happened that threatened to undo all the progress they had made. It was late one afternoon when Keanu received an email that made his stomach drop. The subject line was simple, but its contents carried a heavy weight. Health. Inspection results. Urgent attention needed. Keanu opened the email quickly, scanning through the contents. It was the dreaded report from the latest health inspection, and unfortunately the results were not good. Several issues had been flagged, minor things like cleaning and storage procedures, but also some concerning violations regarding food, safety protocols. If they didn't fix them immediately, the restaurant could face a major fine or worse, a suspension of operations. Keanu felt the familiar tension creeping back into his chest. It was the kind of crisis that no one saw coming, the kind that made you question everything. How had they let it slip? How had they missed the signs? He leaned back in his chair for a moment, processing the information. His first instinct was to gather the team, discuss the issues, and come up with a solution. But then he realized that this wasn't just another hurdle to get over. It was a test. A test of everything they had worked so hard to rebuild. Keanu knew that the kitchen staff had made great strides in their teamwork, but this would be the ultimate challenge. They had to be fast, precise, and organized, and they couldn't afford to slip up now. They couldn't afford to let everything they had fought for fall apart. He called Marco and the rest of the team into the back room to address the situation. "All right, everyone," Keanu started, his voice steady but firm. "We've got a problem. We've got some issues with the health inspection, and we need to take care of them before the restaurant opens tomorrow. I know it's last minute, but we don't have a choice. We can't afford to ignore this." Marco's face tightened, his usual defensiveness creeping in. But instead of getting upset, he nodded. "We'll fix it. What do we need to do?" Keanu glanced around the room, meeting each person's gaze. Lucy, Jamie, even the new hires, everyone was there, ready to pitch in. He could see the determination in their eyes, and that gave him a small sense of relief. We need to go through every corner of this place. We'll split up into teams. Lucy, you and Jamie check the storage and cleaning procedures. I want every single area double-checked, and I mean everything. Marco, you're with me. We'll go through the kitchen to make sure every station is up to code. It's going to be long hours, but if we work together, we'll get this done. As the team dispersed to start their tasks, Keanu felt a sense of pride. This wasn't the same team that had struggled to communicate and work together. Just a few weeks ago, they were focused, they were determined, they knew what was at stake, and they weren't about to let anything ruin what they had built. The next few hours were a blur of activity. The kitchen was bustling with a new kind of energy, an energy that was fueled not by fear or tension, but by purpose. Keanu moved through the kitchen alongside Marco, checking every detail with a fine-toothed comb. The stress was palpable, but the team was handling it. Lucy and Jamie worked quickly, fixing cleaning issues and reorganizing storage spaces with a speed that surprised Keanu. Even the newer staff members were stepping up, working with a sense of responsibility that he hadn't expected. As the clock ticked past midnight, the team took a brief break. Keanu sat down for a moment, rubbing his eyes. He had been running on adrenaline for hours, but the work wasn't done yet. Marco walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. "We're getting close, just a few more things to fix. We've got this, right?" Keanu gave him a tired but determined smile. "Yeah, we've got this. We're almost there." But just as the words left his mouth, they heard a loud crash. From the back of the kitchen, the team froze and Keanu's heart skipped a beat. They all rushed toward the sound, finding one of the new shelves had collapsed in the dry storage area, sending boxes of supplies tumbling to the ground. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Keanu took in the mess, the scattered supplies, and the frustration starting to build in the eyes of the team. This was the last thing they needed. They were so close to being done, but now they had one more crisis to tackle. Keanu took a deep breath, refusing to let panic take over. He turned to Marco, who was already walking toward the mess. "Get the team to help clean this up. Don't rush it. We're not losing our cool over this." Marco nodded without hesitation, his tone steady. "Got it." Keanu's gaze swept over the room, looking at his team. "All right, everyone, this is our last hurdle. Let's finish this right together." The next hour was a blur of activity, picking up the mess, organizing the fallen supplies, and making sure everything was properly stored. Keanu worked alongside them, making sure they stayed on track, keeping everyone calm and focused. It was exhausting, but the team didn't falter. There was no argument, no hesitation. They just worked. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Keanu stood back and surveyed the kitchen. It was spotless. Everything had been double-checked. Every station was up to code, every corner cleaned, every box properly organized. The team had done it. They had pulled together and fixed the problems despite the late hour and the pressure. Keanu's heart swelled with pride. They had proven something to themselves, something bigger than just running. A restaurant. They had shown that they were capable of anything, as long as they worked as one. Marco stood next to him, exhausted but grinning. "I think we did it. We're ready." Keanu smiled back. "Yeah, we are." As they cleaned up the last of the mess, Keanu allowed himself a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The struggles, the tension, the chaos, it had all led to this. The kitchen wasn't just a place of work anymore. It was a family, a team, and a home. "Let's make sure we keep this up," Keanu said as they wrapped up. "The work's never done, but this kitchen is ours. We're going to make it great every single day." The health inspection was scheduled for 8 a.m. the next day. As the team gathered around in the quiet hours of the morning, there was a palpable sense of tension in the air. Despite the exhausting hours they had just spent fixing the kitchen, there was still one final test to pass, the official inspection. Keanu stood at the front of the kitchen, watching his team as they prepped for the big moment. The sound of clattering, knives, sizzling pans, and the occasional laugh from Jamie lightened the air, but Keanu could see the nervousness in their eyes. This was it. They had poured everything into making sure the kitchen was up to standard. All that was left was to face the inspector. Marco, who had always been the most guarded member of the team, approached Keanu. His usual tough exterior was softened this morning. "Keanu, I don't know what to say, man. This whole thing, it's been a ride. I'm proud of what we've done here, proud of the team, I'm proud of myself." Keanu gave him a sincere smile. "You should be, Marco. You've come a long way. You've all come a long way. But this isn't just about today. It's about how we keep showing up. It's about what we build together every single day. And today is just one more step." Marco nodded, his gaze lingering on the team as they finished prepping for the inspection. The room was buzzing with a quiet anticipation, but Keanu could sense the change. The team wasn't just waiting for the inspector to arrive. They were ready to face whatever came next. A few moments later, the door opened and the health inspector walked in. He was tall, wearing a crisp uniform, and looked every bit the no-nonsense professional. His eyes scanned the kitchen immediately, taking in every detail, and the team fell silent. Keanu stood at the front, offering a warm but professional smile. "Good morning. I'm Keanu, the owner. We've been working hard to make sure everything's up to code. If you'd like to start the inspection, we're ready." The inspector didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked around inspecting the counters, the fridge, the storage spaces, the sinks. He asked a few questions here and there, making notes on his clipboard. Marco, Lucy, Jamie, and the others continued with their tasks, maintaining an air of quiet confidence, though Keanu could sense the tension under the surface. Minutes passed, then an hour. Keanu watched as the inspector moved between stations, his pen scratching against his clipboard as he inspected every corner of the kitchen. The tension was suffocating, and the silence stretched between them like a tightrope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the inspector set down his clipboard and turned to Keanu. "Well, I've seen everything I need to see. I'll be honest, I came in here expecting trouble, but I've got to admit I'm impressed. Everything's up to code, everything's been fixed, and this kitchen is cleaner than I've seen in a long time. You've got a solid team here." Keanu let out the breath he didn't realize he was holding. His team, still in the middle of their prep, exchanged glances and the tension in the room started to dissolve. Lucy let out a quiet, relieved laugh. Marco grinned from ear to ear, his usual stoicism giving way to a rare display of joy. Jamie high-fived the new dishwasher, who looked equally as stunned. The inspector smiled, a small but approving nod. "I'm passing you. Keep up the good work." With that, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving the team standing in stunned silence for a moment. And then the room erupted into cheers. "We did it!" Jamie shouted, throwing his arms up. Keanu watched his team, his heart swelling with pride. They had done it. Against the odds, against the setbacks, they had pulled together and turned this place into something they could all be proud of. "Yeah, we did," Keanu said, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "This is just the beginning." Later that afternoon, the team gathered around the small back table, a celebratory spread of food in front of them. Pizza, sandwiches, and a few bottles of soda were laid out. It wasn't much, but it was all they needed. They had made it through the toughest challenge yet. The relief in the air was palpable, and the team, normally scattered between shifts, was finally able to sit together as one. Keanu raised his glass of soda, giving a small toast to teamwork, to trust, and to the future of Keanu's kitchen. The team clinked their glasses together, their smiles genuine, their laughter a far cry from the tension that had once ruled this space. Marco leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed but his expression open. "I don't think I ever would have gotten here without you, Keanu. You pushed me when I didn't want to be pushed, and I get it now, I really do. I've been trying to control everything for so long, but sometimes letting go and trusting the team, trusting each other, that's what makes all the difference." Keanu nodded. "That's what it's all about. We all have to show up, and we have to show up for each other. That's how you build something strong. That's how you build a family." Lucy, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke up. "I used to think this place was just a job. I didn't think it was ever going to be more than that. But now it feels like home." Keanu smiled at her, feeling a wave of pride wash over him. That's what it should feel like. It's not just about cooking food. It's about cooking with love and building something together. Jamie raised his hand as if to make a point. And let's not forget, Keanu's kitchen is officially ready for business. Everyone laughed, the light-heartedness in the air undeniable. The days after the inspection were filled with a newfound sense of purpose. The kitchen ran smoothly, the team worked seamlessly together, and Keanu's kitchen became a beacon of success in the community. Keanu had learned more than just how to run a kitchen. He had learned how to lead with empathy, to embrace change, and to build a place where people could truly thrive. The road ahead wasn't without challenges. There would always be obstacles, moments of doubt, and days when things didn't go according to plan. But Keanu knew one thing for sure. As long as his team was together, as long as they kept showing up for each other, they could face anything. In the end, it wasn't about how successful the restaurant was. It was about the people, the relationships, and the lessons they learned together. It was about the rebirth of a kitchen and of the people who worked in it, and that, Keanu thought, was more than enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough?